A-level biology video with Mr. Phillips. Today we're going to be continuing looking at exchange systems and focusing it on the human exchange system, which is obviously the lungs and the alveoli. So what do we need to know? Well, you should know this for GCSE, to be all honest with you, but you need to know the structure of the gas exchange system for humans. So obviously we have the mouth where we breathe in and the nasal cavity where the air comes in. That then passes the epiglottis, and the epiglottis is a muscle that closes when you swallow your food to make sure your food goes down your esophagus to your stomach and it doesn't block your windpipe, which is also known as your trachea. And you'll notice your trachea is surrounded by layers of rings of cartilage, which we'll talk about later on. The trachea then splits into the bronchus, which splits into lots of tubes called the bronchioles. And then the bronchioles finish off at the alveoli, which is actually spelt wrong in this diagram, so please don't spell it like that, it's spelled with an E. We're surrounded by the ribs to protect the lungs, and obviously they're involved in inspiration and expiration, which we'll talk about later on. The diaphragm, which again is a muscle at the bottom of what we call the thoracic cavity, which this whole thing is. And then we've got the intercostal muscles, which we'll talk about later on as well. So the ribs, the intercostal muscles, and the diaphragm all aid the breathing process, which we'll talk about in the next few minutes. So, what are the key features of a gas exchange system and why are they needed? So if we have a look at this, this is the same sort of question as you might get on the gills of a fish, or external gills, or in something like axolotls. So obviously they've got a large surface area. Okay, so the alveoli are small but in large numbers. That gives them a large surface area. What's the value of that? Well, that means that more molecules can diffuse at once, and therefore you have a higher rate of diffusion. You've got the fact that the alveoli are thin, they're one cell thick. You've got thin cells, they're made up of something called squamous epithelial cells, sometimes called pavement cells, which are like thin squashed cells, which decreases the diffusion distance and again helps diffusion happen much quicker. The diffusion gradient is maintained by having a good blood supply, or the concentration gradient would be a slightly better way of saying that. And that means you maintain that high concentration to low concentration, allowing the gases to diffuse effectively. They're protected from drying out because there's something called a surfactant that coats the alveoli, and it does a couple of different things. It allows them to never dry out, which allows them to expand constantly and contract constantly, but also it has this stops something called the cohesive forces of water. So the fact this surfactants in your lungs stops the water particles collecting into puddles at the bottom of your alveoli, which would actually cause your alveoli to collapse. Really important. Now, you need to know, as basic as this seems, you do need to know that pathway of air into the lungs. So the air travels from the mouth and nose down the trachea, into the bronchi, into the bronchioles, and then into the alveoli. And obviously from the alveoli, it goes through the alveolar epithelium, which is the layer of cells. So epithelium cells are always on the external cells, and these technically are in the environment. And it goes through the capillary endothelium and then into the bloodstream, into the erythrocyte. So just to give you a bit of an extra bit here, this shows you a transverse section of the bronchus, or the bronchi, and the trachea. So the trachea is your windpipe going down your throat. Okay, and you can see here we've got very thick layers of cartilage because obviously it's quite exposed. So you need this, they're called incomplete C rings, because this bit here obviously isn't completed. Okay, and that means that they're strong because they're made of cartilage, but it also means that you're able to move your neck quite freely. You've got smooth elastic muscles and smooth muscle and elastic fibers, and that basically helps contraction and expansion as you breathe in and out, and it allows you to move your muscles and things like that. Okay, you've got ciliated epithelial cells with goblet cells. Now, goblet cells are a type of mucus secreting cell. So they release the mucus captures bacteria, and then ciliated epithelial cells waft up the mucus to the top of your mouth and to back in your mouth, sorry, and then you swallow it and it goes down to your stomach acid. And obviously you've got blood vessels supplying these cells with oxygen and glucose to do aerobic respiration. We have a look at the bronchi in comparison. You've got some smooth muscle still, but you've got very, very little cartilage, and you've again got ciliated epithelial cells, which will help with the mucus that's produced by the goblet cells. They'll catch a bacteria and waft it up to the back of your mouth again. There is some elastic tissue and some cartilage, but very, very little. So the main difference is the lack of cartilage, and that is because they're getting narrower and narrower until they go down into the alveoli. whereas and also don't forget they're in your lungs at this point, whereas the protection is much more needed, greater needed for the trachea. Okay, so gas exchange is the movement of gases by diffusion between an organism and its environment across a barrier such as the alveoli wall. You should know that the amount of oxygen breathed in every breath is 21%, and about 15-16% is breathed out. So it shows we use about 4%, 5%. Carbon dioxide, very little carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, even though we famously talk about it for global warming. We breathe out over 4% because obviously we're producing it in respiration. Now we need to say then, how are the alveoli, how the lungs adapted for their functions? A really common question that could come up, a relatively straightforward question, should be after GCSE, but we do need to just make sure we can cover it. So as you see here, you've got the alveoli in detail. The alveoli has got a large surface area. And that is to allow the large volume of oxygen needed to enter the blood cells so you could do respiration with them. Okay, you then need thin walls that are close to the bloodstream. So you've got this thin layer. We talked about pavement or squamous epithelial cells, these very thin cells here in the wall of the alveoli effectively. And that really gives a short diffusion distance. Okay, you've got a close capillary network which keeps a constant concentration gradient. So the blood comes in and it's always bringing in fresh carbon dioxide from the body. So you have high to low carbon dioxide, and as soon as the oxygen moves into the bloodstream, the oxygen is taken away, maintaining that higher concentration to a lower concentration. Apologies if you just heard my son shout spider. Apparently there's a very big spider downstairs. The last one then is that we need a moist surface to enable the diffusion, and that helps diffusion, but also allows this prevention of cohesion forces, as we spoke about before. You might see a picture under a microscope of an alveoli, and this I think is important to show you because a lot of times you see this, people don't realise. The alveoli is obviously extremely small, and sometimes the scale of things people don't necessarily realise. So this here is actually a macrophage on the surface of the alveoli. So one macrophage, a very big white blood cell. You've been told about macrophages on the surface of white blood cells, which makes, on the surface of the alveoli, trying to stop bacteria getting in, and this is an example of that. And the last part is then about breathing in, which is called inspiration, and obviously expiration is the exact opposite of this. So breathing in is an active process, and it involves the diaphragm and intercostal muscles contracting. I believe it's the external intercostal muscles contracting. The diaphragm then moves down, okay, so it goes down, and that increases the volume of your thoracic cavity. Your thoracic cavity is like this whole area here, effectively. Okay, the intercostal muscles pull the ribs up, expanding the rib cage and increasing the volume. So as you're increasing the volume, Boyle's law, that'll mean you decrease the air pressure, and that lowers the air pressure inside your lungs less than in the atmosphere around us. So the air is then pushed into your lungs, and as a result you obviously get oxygen. When you breathe out, it's mainly a passive process, but it can be reinforced. So you obviously breathe out quite quietly, but you can breathe out with extra force, and that is, you could just use the internal intercostal muscles and use some energy to force that out as well. But breathing in would be the diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax. The diaphragm obviously would move upwards. This decreases the volume of the thoracic cavity, your ribs move down, and that lowers the decreases the volume, and that increases the air pressure in your lungs. As I said, it can be accompanied by the active contraction of the internal intercostal muscles, which will help decrease that volume of your thoracic cavity. Now, that's been useful, guys, and I'll see you again soon.